I like talking to Jordan Peterson because he's a very serious man, and he doesn't let you off the hook. I mean that in a good way. Like, he'll really pursue a question, and if he finds something puzzling, he'll want to know more about it. And we talked about pretty deep themes.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. We've shuffled around our titles a little bit, but it's good to be here with you. We got a great discussion today about Bishop Barron's recent conversation with Jordan Peterson. We're going to recap that dialogue. We're going to get Bishop Barron's thoughts about it, and we're going to revisit some of the key moments and turning points from their conversation. But before we get there, Bishop Barron, good to see you. I know you said it's kind of hot there in your new Santa Barbara studio, isn't it?
It's very rare to be hot in the studio. Normally, I'm really cold in here. There's no air conditioning in Santa Barbara. That always surprises people because the weather is usually so perfect out here, no one needs it. But occasionally in the summertime, it gets a little warm. So for the first time ever, I'm a little warm in the studio. So if you see me sweating, it's not because you're making me nervous,
Well, before we get to the Jordan Peterson conversation, a couple of Word on Fire updates here. First of all, you just returned yesterday from Los Angeles, where you were engaging in a long dialogue. I think you said it went almost 8 hours, 9 hours, about season 2 of the hit film series, The Chosen. Lots of people have been talking about this, raving about it. What were you there for in particular? What did you guys talk about?
I was there with Dallas Jenkins, who's the writer and the producer and the guy behind The Chosen, and then with two other gentlemen. One was a Messianic Jew, so a Jewish rabbi, but who accepts Jesus as the Lord and Savior, and then with a wonderful professor from Biola University, a Protestant scripture scholar. And they have been both very involved in the writing of the script, so they're really invested in the program. They asked me to come on as a Catholic voice to assess the series from a Catholic standpoint. So we went episode by episode, season 2, all 8. So I got advanced copies of some of the ones that we haven't seen yet. And, it was an interesting day. We covered a lot of ground, a lot of different issues and questions, and they would look at it from a Jewish and then evangelical, and then I from a Catholic perspective. Questions of Mary, questions of forgiveness and salvation, questions of Jesus, the play of the natures between Jesus. I mean, all of this was grist for the mill, but it was good. It was a good day.
I'm sure by the time this episode releases, those videos will be available. So we'll link to them, and if not, follow Bishop Barron on social media. I'm sure we'll share them there. Second update, I feel like every time you and I get together, Bishop, we're announcing a new book from Word on Fire, and today we got a new one. It is titled After Humanity, A Guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. Now, a quick word about this book. It was written by Michael Ward, who is arguably the greatest C.S. Lewis scholar in the world. He wrote the groundbreaking book Planet Narnia, which uncovered this secret code. C.S. Lewis embedded it in the Narnia books. But he's widely recognized for his scholarship on the work of Lewis. And this book is the first ever guide to the book that Lewis himself described as maybe his favorite book. And Lewis said one that was not really discussed by the public, called The Abolition of Man. I know you've read this new book and you've read The Abolition of Man. So tell us a little bit about this title.
Yeah, real proud of this book. I read it in manuscript form several months ago and loved it. The Abolition of Man, very short text, but I think pivotal. And I just wrote a column really on this theme because I think it has great relevance to today when we've so relativized our sense of value and truth. I don't know any book like Michael Ward's here that looks almost in a line-by-line way at the abolition of man, and also gives I thought, really fascinating historical background and sort of conceptual background to the text. It's also got great pictures. I love the pictures in the middle of all the key players that were involved in it. So anyone that loves Lewis, get it. It's one of the best Lewis books out there now, I think. Anyone who is interested, and who shouldn't be, in this theme of objective truth and value will benefit from this book. And then we're also able to, aren't we giving with it, Brandon? If you buy that book, you get this little edition of The Abolition of Man itself. It's a very short text, and we're publishing it with the same cover, right, as the Michael Ward book. So it's a great deal. Get it.
Yeah, so go to the website wordonfire.org/humanity. When you order Michael's book, as Bishop Barron said, we'll give you for free C.S. Lewis's book titled The Abolition of Man. So you get the original book plus the new commentary. It's a great package together. All right, let us move now to your recent dialogue with Jordan Peterson. This was the second time the two of you sat down for yet another 2-hour discussion. This one was titled Christianity and the Modern World. It was recorded in March. It was published in April on Jordan Peterson's YouTube channel. Last I checked, it has almost 800,000 views and over 10,000 comments. So clearly struck a nerve among people. And when you read the comments, you'll see the wide range of people who enjoyed this discussion: atheists, agnostics, Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox. Like, everybody just loved a serious, respectful conversation about religion. So let's start with your initial impressions. What was your takeaway? What did you think? How did this one go compared to the first one?
Well, I loved it. It was it wasn't back in March. It doesn't seem that long ago, but I remember being very cold in the studio when I was recording that. I loved it. I thought it was a great conversation. We covered a lot of interesting things. I like talking to Jordan Peterson because he's a very serious man, and he doesn't let you off the hook. I mean that in a good way. Like, he'll really pursue a question, and if he finds something puzzling, he'll want to know more about it. And we talked about pretty deep themes. So I always enjoy that. The first conversation was just before he went through his own kind of sickness, and his wife was so sick, and I think he was in a somewhat difficult emotional space in that first interview. He seemed, like he was going through a lot. He's written a lot about that. You can read it in the beginning of his new book. The second one, to me, he seemed kind of more himself and more, engaged and alert and, pursuing questions. And so, I just enjoyed spending that time with him.
We'll get to this here in a moment, but I noticed in the second one, he seemed to have a more personal and profound analysis of suffering, given this immense amount of suffering he and his wife and his family have gone through. When he spoke about it, you could tell it was so heartfelt and not just abstract.
Not an abstract question. Yeah, quite right. Quite right.
Okay, so about a month ago, when we recapped your dialogue with Alex O'Connor, we went through and played a bunch of short clips and kind of revisited them, got your thoughts on them. We're going to follow that same pattern here. So I've got about 8 clips lined up. They're each about a minute long. So I'll play the clip, and then we'll get your thoughts on each one of them.
Good.
First one is nearly at the very beginning, when Jordan is kind of wondering, asking you, pondering why young people are leaving the Catholic Church. So here's his thoughts on that.
I also think that, and this pertains to something we also talked about discussing, which was the continual drain from the church, the Catholic Church, perhaps in particular, but perhaps not in the West, of young people. And I think part of that is their inability to make intellectual sense of everything that they're faced with, a religious tradition and a scientific tradition, especially on the biological front. But not only that, they don't know where to place these things in their view of the world. I think that's partly why my lectures, because you'd asked about that, had become popular, because I am trying to do that. And
what do you think about his analysis of why young people are leaving the church?
Well, it's backed up by a lot of the research, as you and I both know. People will identify all sorts of things. They think, oh, that's why young people are leaving. But in study after study, it's intellectual problems. I don't believe the doctrine. Or to his point, religious doctrine is at odds with what the sciences tell me, and so that causes a cognitive dissonance. So I agree with him. I think that's true. It's a major block. It's a problem for young people. So if the scientific mode of thought is the dominant one today, we got to find a way at least to reconcile that view of the world with a religious view. See, scientism is attractive in a way because, okay, I can understand everything through the scientific lens, but then they realize in pretty short order, you're not going to adjudicate the deepest questions of life that way. So we have to open those questions, they're properly religious ones, but in such a way that it's not at odds with what they know from a scientific viewpoint. So I think that is a major challenge today. It's a perennial challenge for the church. Aquinas took the dominant intellectual form of his time, Aristotelian science and philosophy, and then tried to show a compatibility with Christian doctrine. Well, the same challenge today, So I quite agree with him. And I think the fact that he's a psychologist, so he's trained in, if you want, a scientific Western tradition, and he's opening up these religious texts and trying to show, at least in his case, their psychological meaning. Great. And young people see, okay, well, he's a scientist and he thinks these texts have some significance. I get it. That makes sense to me. So in that way, he's a John the Baptist type figure, I think, for those who are more explicitly religious.
You mentioned how Jordan's opening up these religious texts. I checked when I was preparing this episode on his Genesis lecture series. So he did a bunch of big, long stand-up lectures on the book of Genesis. And the first video, I think it's 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours long. It has 9 million views. 9 million times people have sat down and watched that. And that leads us here to the second clip where early on in the discussion, you two were talking about the Bible, and Jordan emphasized that the Bible is a book to be taken seriously, not just by believers, but by anybody in the Western tradition. So here's him talking about the Bible.
Well, you hinted at it a bit there by saying, well, look, many people have worked on this for a very, very long period of time, and in some sense, it's a living document.
Yeah.
Right? Because it does have to be, the Bible just doesn't exist as a book on a shelf. It's a pattern of meaning within a context, and the context has to be taken into account. So you say, well, there's a powerful context for its interpretation. It's also a fundamental text in that the Bible is implicit in all sorts of other great texts, like Shakespeare, or anything that's a product of Judeo-Christian culture. That's a deep product, is deeply affected by the Bible. So it's there implicitly, whether you like it or not. And so it has to be taken seriously, I would say, even if you don't believe it. But then to the degree that you believe the central axioms of Western culture, you have to wonder how much of what's biblical you do end up believing because of its implicitness.
Yeah, I think, Brandon, there he's going after, as I would too, this sort of easy dismissal of the Bible on the part of the new atheists. So think of, the Sam Harrises and Christopher Hitchens of the world, who just in a very cavalier way, dismiss the Bible as pre-scientific nonsense and Bronze Age mythology and all these poor things. They didn't, know a molecule from an atom, and yet they're carrying on. Well, that sort of dismissal is really destructive. First of all, it's stupid because, as he points out, this is the master text of Western civilization in many ways. And the brightest people, up until, let's say, the scientific era, the brightest people in our culture were focused upon it. And so if it's just a bunch of old, wives' tales and silly nonsense, that doesn't hold. It's not tenable. But then again, the question is, all right, well, how do I read it seriously and hang on to what I know from other sources of knowledge? And that's, I think, for me, a legitimately Catholic way to do it. We don't isolate the Bible as though it has no relation to what we know from other disciplines. No, it's got to be in dialogue with that at the very least, because we don't bifurcate the mind. We don't play the double truth game. That Aquinas fought that in the Middle Ages against the Latin Averroes. So that's still a temptation to say, oh, I'm a scientist, and then I've got this kind of quirky interest in this ancient text. No, you've got to read the ancient text in light of what we know from other fields, but don't let those other fields so dominate the discussion that we relegate the Bible to the margins. So I think that's the space that he and I think Peterson and I would both agree, that's the space we have to move into as we approach the Bible.
All right, that takes us to about a half hour into the interview, and by this point, you have already talked about things like salvation, justice, the Bible, and now you're getting into good and evil. So you guys, of course, stayed on the surface here of these conversations. But here's where you and Peterson had, I think, your major disagreement throughout the dialogue. And I want to spend a little more time on this because I feel like during the discussion, you didn't have enough time to unpack your view. But here's the fundamental point. You argued that people always pursue what they perceive to be the good. And that if somebody does something evil, it's not because they want to do evil per se, but that they think the evil thing they're doing is a good, that they're somehow deceived. Peterson viciously disagreed with that, and he brought up the example of Cain and Abel in Genesis. So let me play his Cain and Abel argument, and then we'll let you spend some more time talking about this.
Cain is resentful. He has his reasons. His sacrifices were repudiated by God for reasons that aren't made clear in the text, which is a great ambiguity, because often our sacrifices are repudiated. And Cain is bitter, and no wonder. And he has Abel around to rub his nose in it as well. But Cain's reaction is, I'm going to destroy what God values most. And that, now you might say, well, Cain is conflicted and ambivalent about that, and I believe that, but I don't think he was seeking the good when he struck down. He was shaking his fist at God.
Yeah, indeed he was, objectively, but he was seeking at least the apparent good for him. In his twisted mind, he thought that was the good.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I think you can get to a point where you're so resentful. I really believe this, that you're so resentful that you will do harm to yourself.
No, but see, in a way, Brandon, this is to me, it's not a controversial issue, and I think we're probably talking past each other. All I'm relying on there is the famous Thomistic adage, right? That even the most wicked person is seeking at least the apparent good. And that's just because of the structure of the will. So I'm not really making a psychological remark here, it's a metaphysical remark, or it's a remark of philosophical anthropology. The will, by its very structure, seeks the good. Now, objectively speaking, it might be very bad what the will is seeking. So we're all sinners, we know about that. Cain is a sinner, and he's seeking something objectively bad, namely the death of his brother. But given the structure of the will can't choose what it doesn't see as in any way good. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an act of the will. So in a way, I'm making a very minimalistic claim, and I think he was taking it in a very maximal way, as though I was saying, well, there really can't be evil people. No, it's just the structure of the will. You're always seeking what's at least apparently the good thing. So, for example, in the Cain case, is getting back at God something that Cain perceived to be a good? Yeah, it would give him a sense of satisfaction. Now, was he wrong about that? Of course. Was that in fact a bad thing to do? Of course. But it was at least the apparent good for him, you know? So I'm not making a grandiose sort of philosophical claim here or about, you know, the nature of good and evil. It's simply a claim about the structure of the will. Now, I do think you can draw a certain conclusion from that. That's part of the imago Dei in us, right? That we have this image of God in us, and it's in especially the mind and the will, our great tradition says. So even the perverse will is still acting out of that imago because it's pursuing at least the apparent good. So I'll cling to that. I think there is something right in saying, I never, even Hitler, even the worst people, I never want to relegate to just utter darkness, because then you're involving yourself in some metaphysical contradictions, as though evil has its own substance. It's in some ways a cousin of the question of the nature of evil. We would say evil is always a privatio boni, right? It's a privation of the good. So the bad will is never utterly bad, because if it were, it wouldn't exist. And there's no such thing as an utterly bad will in that sense. It's always seeking at least the apparent good. So in a way, it's not as grandiose a question as he's making it there. It's more of a fundamental question, but it does speak to a degree to the imago Dei. I'll say that, you know. And as if you want a ground for hope, where sin abounds, grace abounds the more.
Doesn't Thomas say something like, in the end, everybody from the greatest saint to the greatest sinner seeks happiness?
Yeah,
and
right.
that to your point, even those people seeking evil, destructive things are in the end seeking their own happiness. And we might raise the counterexample of, you know, somebody who just wants to make themselves miserable. They're masochistic or sadistic, and they're pursuing unhappiness. But then you could say even those people are aiming to find happiness in their unhappiness, in their destructive behavior.
Right. There's something attractive. Now, he's perverse, yes. Wrong-headed, yes. Let's try to get him out of it, of course. But yeah, they're seeking what at least appears to them to be the route of happiness. Even someone who commits suicide, what are they seeking but a peace beyond the awful struggle that they're in? They're seeking the good in that sense. So I'm just following Thomas Aquinas there.
All right, this takes us to about the 45-minute mark, and from about 45 minutes to an hour and a half, you guys had a really good 45-minute discussion about Jesus. And I think this is what most viewers were waiting for, because Peterson, his views toward Jesus, I think, have been developing over the last several months. You're a Catholic bishop. It seems like Peterson's kind of stuck on the historicity of Jesus or his resurrection. So the next few questions I want to play have to do with Jesus, and I want to give you some chance to unpack that. So first of all, we're going to talk about the cross. Here's Peterson analyzing what he thinks happens on the cross and what the cross represents.
So Christ is tortured by betrayal, by physically, and spiritually as well, because the best way to torment someone is to punish them despite their innocence, right?
Yeah,
so, right. Or maybe worse than that, to punish them because of their virtues. That's even better. And so that's intrinsic in the story as well. Christ bears up under that. He doesn't repudiate God, or doesn't repudiate his own essence. It's something like that. Then what is the example of that? Is the example of bearing up under that exceptional duress and maintaining a moral stance, is that the example that redeems the world? Is it that if you do that in your own life, the world is de facto redeemed?
Yeah, what does the cross mean? We've been debating that and musing about it for 2,000 years. It's interesting to me, Brandon, that the church has never given a definitive interpretation that the cross of Jesus saves us from our sins. Yeah, that's the doctrine of the church. Now, how does that happen? Well, now, pick your theory. You've got theories from the Christus Victor theory of the church fathers through the famous atonement theories of Anselm to all sorts of other theories that have arisen today. Is there something to this, I'd call it psychodynamic reading of the cross that Jordan Peterson pursues? Sure. Is Jesus, in fact, a great moral exemplar on the cross? Of course, Thomas Aquinas says that. If you want to see these 5 great virtues, look to the cross. And does that contribute to our redemption and salvation? Sure, I would say. Think here of Abelard, who said the cross is love awakening love. So we see in the love displayed on the cross, and maybe using Peterson's suggestion there, that Jesus' love for the Father despite all of these, obstacles and opposition. Okay, there's something to that, it seems to me. But I'd want to press it further. I'm a little wary of cross as moral example, because it does seem to me a very modern way to do it. And you were right earlier, I'll put my theologian's hat on a bit here, but the German philosopher Lessing, who famously said there's a gulf that yawns between the data of history and then the absolute certitudes of reason, right? History is always ambiguous and who really knows and so on. And then there's these high truths of reason. And there's a gulf between them. And so the point there is, well, the historical Jesus and what really happened, who knows? It's all so murky and obscure. But yet we want to make these sort of high definitive claims. And how do you get past Lessing's gulf? That becomes a major preoccupation of modern theology. I won't bore you, but I think Hegel and everybody else are trying to deal with Lessing's gulf. Well, one way to do that is Kant's way, and I've always felt that Peterson is somewhat Kantian in his approach. Kant would say, the historical Jesus, who knows? Who knows what was going on back then? But we have these great stories in the Gospels that present to us the archetype of the person perfectly pleasing to God. So this story of Jesus who preaches and heals and is upright in every possible way, and yes, even goes to his death despite opposition because of his faithfulness to God. What you see, according to Kant, is there it is, the archetype of the person perfectly pleasing to God. And I look at that archetype and say, hey, I should be like that too, right? And that's how Jesus saves. Well, okay, but it's such a reductive approach. And I say a plague on Lessing's gulf. I don't buy that. And Christianity is unavoidably a historical religion. We're not just making abstract moral and philosophical claims. It's in this Jesus that we find the incarnation of the Son of God. It's in this Jesus who really died and really rose from the dead that we find our salvation. This Jesus who founds a church which endures to the present day, we can look around and see the extension of the mystical body through space and time. My point is, I'm not interested in Lessing's Gulf. I don't think we have to deal with Lessing's Gulf. I think Christianity is grounded credibly in historical realities that do yield to us these enduring truths. Now, that's a long way of saying, as I listened to Jordan Peterson, I heard very much a kind of a Kantian account of the cross. And I want to say, okay, as far as it goes, but we got to go a lot further.
Well, if you're just joining us, we're talking with Bishop Barron about his recent 2-hour-long discussion with Jordan Peterson. It was the second conversation the two men have shared. We're going through it and analyzing some of the key moments and pivotal points throughout the discussion. We got a few more clips left here, Bishop. Sticking on the theme of Jesus, Peterson next turned to the topic of Christ and the Eucharist, which he describes as the great adventure that's not being given to young people. I think, I can't remember if I have it in the clip or not, but at one point you kind of interjected and said, I wish you would preach to our people about the Eucharist and the power of the Eucharist. So let me play that clip here.
Yeah.
So now, in Orthodox Christianity, as I understand it, there seems to me to be more emphasis on the idea that it's each human's obligation to become like Christ. That's the goal. Well, that's that by definition, we could say, and we could speak psychologically about this as well, that means to become the ideal that's beyond rationality. Even that's what you're aiming at. That's what's hypothetically within your grasp. And it seems to me as well that that's what the Mass symbolizes, is that, and I'd be happy to have any objections to this, I would be happy to hear. The incorporation of the host is the embodiment, it's the incarnation of Christ within. That's what it's acting out. That's the idea. I mean, in some sense, it's the consumption of the saving element, but the saving element is actually a mode of being. And this isn't hit home. It's like, look what the church demands everything of you.
Yeah.
Absolutely everything. And the reason that people are leaving is because that adventure isn't being put before them.
Yes.
It's like, look, you can have your cars and your money and all of that, but that's nothing compared to the adventure that you could be going on.
What do you think about Jordan Peterson, the preacher there?
Yeah, and the two sections, you're right. What he was saying about the Eucharist, I would say, is largely right. I would refine the language a bit, and it's, again, maybe tending in a more psychologizing direction. But if you listen to him there, and it was interesting for me to listen to him again, it's pretty good. He's pretty close to, I'd say, a healthy Catholic objectivism about the Eucharist. But his real point, I think, is the moral one and the spiritual one about the full implication. If you say amen when the priest says to you, the body of Christ, and then you ingest, you eat and drink the body and blood of Jesus, you're not playing around there. That's a very serious move because you're internalizing spiritually, psychologically, even physically, the incarnate Son of God. And that means you are, yes, indeed, being drawn into his power. I would say grace and then the cooperation with grace. And what he's saying there, I think quite correctly, is, boy, have we underplayed the proper demand of this. We've not held out to our young people this high adventure, moral and spiritual adventure of conformity with Christ. If a young kid just blandly says, amen, and puts the Eucharist in his mouth and goes back and then starts daydreaming, you're not beginning to sense the power of what you've done. And we're at fault, I would say. We church men and women are at fault in not calling our young people to much higher ideals. So I like him there. And see, the thing is, the fact that it's Jordan Peterson saying that, who more than probably anyone in our culture right now is in fact calling younger people to a higher intellectual and moral adventure. That's how I'd see his attractiveness. So that's why, this, Brandon, a few years ago when I got up in front of all my brother bishops and I just said, the Peterson phenomenon is a sign of hope. And that's what I meant, was this serious man talking in a serious way about I call them psychological and spiritual matters and talking about the Bible, is attracting a giant audience of young people, especially men. I mean, come on. We're nowhere in that ballpark. So I took it as a sign of hope that we can and should talk about our issues in a high, serious way. But, look, my generation, we got the dumbed down and namby-pamby version of it, and we were so convinced somehow that kids weren't up to it. Trust me, I mean, that's what I took in as a young man was that, religion, obviously they can't handle anything that's serious, and if we get serious, they're going to run away. Au contraire, right? I mean, I think just the contrary. What they ran away from was this wimpy, namby-pamby religion. Of course they do, because they grew up. Talk to people my generation. I got the grace of discovering Thomas Aquinas when I was a kid. That was a sheer grace that led me down a more serious path. Talk to my colleagues, though, my age. They were met with the banners and balloons, and so of course they ran away. What Peterson is saying there, I think quite rightly, is no, the contrary. Give young people a high intellectual and moral challenge, and they'll respond to it.
We got a couple more clips to go. I mentioned we were on a whole kick around Jesus. So we talked about Jesus on the cross, then just now Jesus in the Eucharist. This next one is the resurrection of Jesus. Yeah. And again, you see Jordan grappling with, on the one hand, the psychological reading of the resurrection, but then on the other hand, the question of its historical reality. Did it really happen? So here's Jordan.
But then there's the insistence in the church of the bodily resurrection, which is, well, let's call that a stumbling block to modern belief. No doubt about that. That's something more than mere metaphor. And so you might ask, well, why is it insisted upon? Why isn't the proposition that you have a transcendent moral obligation to bear, to operate for the good of all things, regardless of your suffering, a hard line, no justification with the defeat of death necessitated? I'm not trying to make a fundamental critique of the idea of the resurrection, because I know there are things that I don't know. I know that for sure. And God only knows how the world is fundamentally structured. But it seems, and this is a Nietzschean criticism in some sense too, and a Freudian criticism, that seems in some real sense too good to be true.
Yeah.
So, and so what do you make of the resurrection? How do you conceptualize it, even as it's related in the Gospels?
Yeah, I forget what I said to him that day, but I like the honesty of the question a lot. And even that acknowledgement of it's too good to be true, there's a lot in that. Because, Brandon, the resurrection, the bodily resurrection, has been a stumbling block from the beginning. It's not as though, those, pre-scientific people, they believed any old nonsense. I mean, that's for the birds. You see it in the Gospels themselves as they're struggling to understand what it is they're seeing and taking in. There were all kinds of models for understanding what happened to someone after he or she died in Jesus' time, and they were trying to fit this novelty into those, and the categories were breaking and so on. My point is, his struggle in the year 2021 was their struggle in the year 30. So I don't want to domesticate the resurrection and say, okay, well, we'll explain it symbolically or psychologically or archetypally. Yeah, we can do all that, and there's something to it, but gosh, it makes the resurrection too easy. It's meant to be something that is challenging. Now, why? Because God is doing something in the resurrection. Namely, he's remaking his creation. The body matters. And that's a Jewish perspective. See, we're still very haunted by Plato, it seems to me, that the serious stuff is going on at the ideational level and the formal level and the abstract philosophical, and then there's the body. And I think it's Plato, I think it's a Gnostic holdover. But Christianity is a Jewish movement, and the body, well, that's me. I'm my body. I'm a soul that's floating above or inside my body. So the bodily resurrection of Jesus means God is doing something new. In fact, that's, as they mused on it, a new heavens and a new earth are emerging. that the fallen world is being remade and lifted up to a new place. And those are some of the implications of the belief in the bodily resurrection. Is it weird and strange, hard to believe? Yeah. I'm with Kierkegaard, who famously said the point of theology is to make doctrine hard to believe. Because it runs against every instinct we have from liberalism, which is, no, just try to make it as credible as possible. Yeah, but the trouble is you make it as credible as possible, then you lock it into our little framework of understanding, where the power of the Bible is this sort of breaking of the old category. Something new and fresh has happened. And so make it hard to believe. So those great scenes in the Gospels where they see him, they worshiped, and they doubted. The Gospels are trying to communicate to us that they were trying to figure out what in the world is this, Okay, because God is making a new world in Jesus. Something new has broken in. And so I don't want to relegate the bodiliness of the resurrection to some kind of pre-scientific or primitive way of talking. No, I say a plague on Gnosticism. I'm for a robustly biblical view of it, I think one thing I might have said to Jordan Peterson was take the archetypal language of Jung, which he loves, and I love too. I love Jung, and yes, indeed, the archetype of death and resurrection and so on. Okay, but what would it look like if an archetype came true? That an archetype left the realm of just ideation and took flesh, and indeed. St. John will say, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Word, the pattern, the logos of God. Would archetypal psychology give us access in a way to the great logos of the world? Okay. But what if the logos became flesh and dwelt among us? Now we're talking. See, now we're into the world of Christianity. So, I get it. This is, Brandon, a tension as old as Christianity itself. Call it if you want between liberalism, conservatism, or between relevance and distinctiveness, or whatever term you want to use, but to make the faith intellectually accessible, but to keep the faith fascinating, and that's the tension. The liberal will always tend toward, let's try to make it understandable. The other side would tend to say, let's keep it distinctive. If it's so distinctive, it becomes peculiar and irrational. But if it's so accessible, it becomes domesticated and boring. And so the great theologians, I think, are walking that ground. So that's where I would maybe invite Jordan Peterson is keep walking that ground between total domestication and irrationality.
Well, let's play one last clip. This is from the very end of your discussion. I think it starts at like the 1 hour, 48-minute mark. And they're kind of some cursory send-off words, but I think they're really important. It was a really important exchange. That's where you and him were talking about his wife. And Jordan revealed that his wife, Tammy, during her time of great suffering, began praying the rosary religiously, for lack of a better word. And she fell in love with the ritual dynamic of that prayer. And you gave him a little advice, but I want to unpack that a little more because, again, it kind of happened at the end of the discussion and you didn't get a chance to say anything about it. So I want to give you a chance here. So let's play the clip.
Tell your wife's name is Tammy, right?
Yes.
Tell her, we did, just came out with it. It's on YouTube, a series of reflections I did on the rosary. And I know with her interest in the rosary that she just go on YouTube and check it out. She might find that interesting.
Yeah, it's too bad we didn't have a chance to talk to that about that because
but just tell her that because I love the rosary too. It's a great prayer and it works at so many different levels. You can look at it psychologically and even physically, what that does to you. So have her look at those maybe and give her my best. And I remember we were in Rome right after you and I spoke the first time. Our team was in Rome doing some filming. And I think I forget whom we sent it to, someone in your office, but we did a little video. And I knew that your wife was very sick at the time. I didn't know that you were on the verge of your issues, But I just said, we said Mass in my room there in Rome, which is in the hotel room, and said it for your wife. So we sent that to you. So let her know that we have been for a long time praying for the two of you.
Well, that's much appreciated and is certainly all the care that people have shown, including the care that you've shown, has been extraordinarily helpful. And she's listening to you on a regular basis.
I appreciate that.
And she certainly found the practice of the rosary. Tammy's quite a physical person, and
Yeah.
so it's practice for her rather than
Right.
an intellectual endeavor. Not that she's incapable of intellectual endeavor, but she's an adept practitioner. So she has
Well, the
done
fact that you
yoga for
hold it
years.
in your hand matters. It's a very physical thing.
Yes, well, it helped her maintain peace while she was facing death.
Yeah.
Essentially, continually, and so that's the ritual element, which we never talked about at all. Partly, I suppose, because we tend towards the abstract and the intellectual,
Right.
but the ritual
Well, next time.
the ritual shouldn't
time.
be. Yes, exactly.
Oh.
The ritual shouldn't be dismissed.
No, I'm a Catholic. Heck, rituals are our whole thing.
Did you want to say a word about Peterson's observation about the ritual power of the rosary?
Sure, he's right, and maybe next time we can talk about it more. The rosary, works, as I said there, at so many different levels. And from the physical, I mean, holding the rosary and the beads, you're breathing as you pray it. I find that just holding the rosary brings a sense of peace to me. And then the psychological dimension, of the mantra-like repetition of the prayers, the calming of the mind, and so on. But then the deepest thing, and if we really had time to talk about it, Mary will always lead you to Christ. And so if Jordan's wife has been drawn to the rosary, I'll speak sort of as a spiritual director in a way. It's only a matter of time before she's brought to Christ, because that's what Mary always does. So if you engage her in prayer, you ask for her intercession, that's what's going to happen. You can ask for all kinds of particular things, and you may or may not get them. That's always up to God. But I can guarantee you that you'll be led closer to Christ. So, I wish her the very best as she continues along that path.
Well, it's time now for our question from our listener. Every episode, we take one question from our listeners. If you have one that you'd like to ask Bishop Barron, send it in to us at the website askbishopbarron.com. Today, we have one from Mary. She lives in California, where Bishop Barron is. She's asking why Catholics put the emphasis on the suffering and crucified Christ instead of the resurrected Christ. Here's your question.
Hi, my name is Mary from Campbell, California, and my question is, how can I answer my Protestant friend who claims Catholics focus too much on suffering and Jesus on the cross and not enough on his resurrection?
Yeah, it's a classic question, and there's obviously always a play between the dying and the rising of Jesus. If Jesus simply died on the cross, that was the end of the story, he'd be of very little interest to anybody. So obviously, we look at Jesus crucified only because we know he's the risen Lord, that cross led to the resurrection. So first of all, just to make that point real clearly, why do we show Jesus crucified, Jesus in his suffering? I'll give you one little hint. We did a series of videos on the rosary, and we talked about the various mysteries, the joyful mysteries and the luminous mysteries and the glorious mysteries. What by far has the most views? The sorrowful mysteries. So, look, in this life, in this world, something we all have in common. We all suffer. And yes, our great hope is for resurrection in the risen Christ. But I don't find it at all puzzling that I think it's the piety of the people. It wasn't so much a doctrinal imposition from above. I would say that's the piety of Catholic people over centuries that has put a stress on the suffering of Jesus, because we all have that in common in this valley of tears, right? We all suffer, and so we naturally gravitate toward Christ in his sufferings. So I would see it less as a doctrinal imposition, as more something that I think welled up very naturally from the piety of the people.
Well, thanks for that question, Mary. And before we go here, a couple of final updates. One of them is to remind you to pick up your copy of our new book. It's titled After Humanity, A Guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. Arguably C.S. Lewis's most important and prophetic nonfiction book, The Abolition of Man. And until now, there has not been a good guide or commentary to that book. But Michael Ward has written one for Word on Fire. So pick it up. When you order it, you will also get a free copy of C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man. So you get both books together. Also, a little teaser. I don't think we've shared this publicly yet, but in 1 month, on July 29th, we're going to be releasing a book at Word on Fire titled Jordan Peterson, God and Christianity, The Search for a Meaningful Life. It's the first book that analyzes all of Peterson's work, including his biblical lectures, both of his best-selling books, from a Christian perspective. It was co-authored by two professors, Dr. Chris Kaiser and Dr. Matthew Petrusik. One of them specializes in philosophy, the other is a theologian. So you get some good Christian Catholic perspectives on Peterson's work. I'm sure we'll be talking about that book as it comes out, but given we are talking about Peterson here, I wanted to give you guys the first chance to hear about that book. Well, thanks so much for listening and watching. We'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel.